Hello, everyone. Welcome to this, the next in our ongoing series of the Great War at 110 Years series. Some of you will have seen the fantastic talk that Steve Marsden did a couple of weeks ago. And now we're very lucky to have our Chief Trustee of Great War Group, Jim Smithson, talking to us today about Battle of Tannenberg. And we're here just only a week or so after the actual anniversary, 110 years, so pretty timely, really. And Jim's given this talk the exciting name of the dynamic duo take on the Russians, which I'm assuming doesn't mean Batman and Robin, but I'm sure we'll learn who and what Jim is referring to there. Of course, most of you will know Jim from Great War Group and elsewhere, of course, very well-known figure in the community of First World War studies. But just in case any of you don't know Jim, by way of a quick biography, he's had a lifetime of interest in military history. And then once he retired from a career teaching, he was able to give his full attention to the subject. He'd also bought a house near Arras in northern France before retirement, which meant that that area then became a focus. And in fact, resulted in a number of books that Jim's written about the 1917 Arras campaign and battles around there. Jim lives in North Oxfordshire as well as spending time in France. Of course, as we know, he's trustee of the Great War Group and a major figure in the organisation. So really glad to have Jim here with us tonight, talking about Tannenberg.
Thank you, Henry. Thank you for that introduction. Very nice. I start with an apology. As Henry said, my granddaughter has given me a really nice cold. I have all the necessary things here, a box of tissues. So if I reach for a tissue during the time, you'll have to excuse me. But I have got some lubrication as well. So hopefully I don't lose my voice. Okay. Now I'm going to start by looking not at any battle to start off with. I'm just going to look at the idea of East and West. Because the Western Front, as we all know it, although in fact it wasn't really our Western Front, it was the German Western Front, but we gave it that name as well, and so did the French. The Western Front is something that we concentrate a massive amount on, obviously because the British and ex-dominions, the Commonwealth countries, obviously have a lot of concentration in that area. There are Gallipolis, there are various other parts of the world and Italy and so on and so forth, which we sometimes sort of move into, but the Western Front tends to dominate. But what you see in a lot of the literature about the Western Front is a total, almost ignorance of the Eastern Front. And by that, I mean that a lot of the literature, when it's talking about events, ignore what's happening on the Eastern Front at the same time, and the effect that that might have had on what's happening on the Western Front. And this battle in 1914 is no different because it does have enormous repercussions. It could have had very different repercussions. It did, in fact, have one particular small effect, almost immediately, the fact that they were fighting the Russians, which I'll be talking about. But if you read any books on the happenings of the British expeditionary force in 14, you read about Mons, you read about the Cateau. We heard from Stephen about the French on the Battle of Frontiers, but any English writing on the Western Front just ignores the Eastern Front, ignores what's going on there totally. But of course, the Germans aren't ignoring it. The Germans can't ignore it because they are now fighting on two fronts. They didn't want to, but they realized that if they had to have a particular plan. And that particular plan is obviously one that comes down to this guy. He's the one, the Chief of the General Staff of the German General Staff. He's the one, von Moltke was the one who took the Schlieffen Plan as it stood, modified it, changed it, whatever. He realized that he had to do something in the West very quickly if they were going to succeed at all. Because he realized that once Russia had mobilized completely, that it would overwhelm the Austro-Hungarians. He knew full well the strength of the Austro-Hungarians. Moltke realized that he had to win very quickly in the West, which is what the plan was all about. Now, I'm not going to get too involved in all of that because that will take up too much time. And I really want to concentrate on what's going on in the East. But what you've got to understand from a date point of view is that almost all of what I'll be talking about is happening at the same time as all of the things that you know about from the British point of view at Mons, Le Cateau, and also that Stephen was talking about with regard to the Battle of the Frontiers. With regard to the fact that early August, that middle August, the sort of 15th to 28th to 30th August, that time when things were happening on the Western Front, the Eastern Front was also hot, very hot, in two different ways. Moltke had to look in both directions all the time. He couldn't just simply concentrate on his plan to go through Belgium, to go through France, to take Paris, to defeat the French, and then take on the Russians, because the Russians were mobilizing at the same time. And the Russians mobilized more quickly than he thought was going to happen. So he was always with one eye over his shoulder, so to speak, looking towards the east. So things that were happening in the east affected his decision making. So when we're talking about all of the Battle of Tannenberg and all of the Eastern Front in 1914, in this particular time, remember everything that's happening there is having repercussions back at the general headquarters of the German army back in Germany for Moltke. It was really nerving him all the time. And when I describe what happened at Tannenberg, you'll see that it wasn't as cut and dried as many brief descriptions of the battle tend to give. That it was a foregone conclusion, the Russians were going to lose, the Germans were going to win, everything was going to be hunky-dory, everything was going to be fine. In fact, Moltke was very scared at one point, very, very, very nervous at one point. So that has to be kept in mind all the way through the next half hour, next 3/4 of an hour or so. In the east, he had commanding his 8th Army, the General Maximilian von Prittwitz. Now, Prittwitz was, and you can see the great picture, as Prussian as you could get. And he was commanding the 8th Army. It was the only army in the east. The rest of the troops that are in the east, and we'll see that on the map in a minute, because you know I like maps, so you're going to get lots of maps tonight. In the east, the only army in the east was 8th Army. And so that gives that level of importance to the role that Prittwitz had. Because he could have, it's almost like the sort of Royal Navy idea of, could he have won or lost the war in a day? Well, perhaps not in a day, but Prittwitz could have actually maybe lost the war for Germany very, very quickly. And that will also give you the idea of why certain events happened very quickly when things got hot in August on the Eastern Front around the northern areas. He was Prussian, as were many of the generals of the German army, and they're fighting in East Prussia. We'll see that from a point of view of the maps later on. He was an established militarian, fought in the Franco-Prussian War, had the usual type of upbringing, was well respected. I don't think he would have been put in the position he was in 8th Army if he hadn't been respected. So he's the figure who's there, but he won't be there for long, as you'll see. Okay. Now, the Russians. Now, the Russians are a mess. Basically, the Russians are a mess because they haven't started the war with a structure in the same way that any of the other forces have. If you've watched any of the talks that people have done about the British Army and the run-up to the war, the French Army in the run-up to the war, the German Army in the run-up to the war, they knew exactly who was going to be Commander-in-Chief, they knew who was going to be the Army Chiefs, they knew all of that. Even the British did. The Russians didn't. The Tsar was thought to become the chief. He would have been normally the Commander-in-Chief. He decided he didn't want to be Commander-in-Chief at the start of the war, so he made this guy, Nikolaevich, Duke Nikolaevich. He made him what was called First Supreme Commander of Stavka. Stavka is the headquarters of the Russian army. And he basically is Commander-in-Chief. He didn't really want the job. And he was not experienced whatsoever. And so, in some respects, in all of the talk that we're going to go on for now, you can almost ignore him because he really didn't have much effect. He really didn't make many decisions. He really wasn't in a position to make many decisions. But just to show you that from the top, you've already got what is almost a command vacuum of downward. From the top downward, you don't have that level of command. The people who really matter for what we're going to talk about tonight are these two. The Russian army was basically in two halves. There was a northern They use various phrases. There was a northwestern forces, as it was called, as we will call it in English, and there was the southern forces, the southwestern forces. And these two armies, First and Second Army, comprise the northern part, the part that we're going to be interested in tonight, which is where the Battle of Tannenberg all happened. Rennenkampf, Samsonov, both had fought in the Russo-Japanese War, both quite experienced commanders, but they came from different camps. And I have to go a little bit higher than them to start to talk about why that was going to cause some problems. Basically, the Minister of War, who was thought to possibly take on the Commander-in-Chief role, because it was an ex-general, and I've got to look carefully to get his name right, which is Sukhomlinov. He was Minister of War, very powerful character. And you were either in his camp or you were not in his camp. And the problem here we have is that Rennenkampf was in his camp and Samsonov wasn't. So they didn't talk to each other. They were two different beings in a sense. And to add real difficulty to that, Rennenkampf's chief of staff was in the opposite camp, and Samsonov's chief of staff was in the opposite camp. So you already had this sort of almost political infighting within the command structure. And what that meant is that you actually had a lack of even verbal communication between some of the commanders and their chief of staff and some of the commanders and people higher up. And the higher up was basically the commander of Northwest Forces, who is Yakov Shalinsky. Now, Shalinsky was nominally in charge of Northwest Forces. So in a sense, he was an army group commander. If you think of it, what you start to see in the West. And he commanded First and Second Army. He commanded these two guys here. But none of these three actually really had any time for each other. So they didn't communicate with each other. And we'll talk about communication a bit more later on. But that mess in that hierarchy of leadership doesn't stop there. It pervades downwards into the Russian army. It is not prepared for war in the sense of the ability of any commanders at army, at corps, at division level to know what their role is and who their commander is, to have respect for their commander. It's a very, very, very old-fashioned czarist form of command. These have not risen in their commands because of their abilities. They've risen because of their political connections. They've risen because of their connection with the Tsar, or not with the Tsar, or with various people, and so on and so forth. So that is really causing a great problem. What then causes a problem for both of these is that before the fighting actually even starts, the chief of the general staff, Yudishkevich, makes a decision. Again, this is because Nikolaevich hasn't got any decision-making possibilities. He makes the decision to actually create two new armies. And I'll talk about that a little bit more when we see the map and why he did that. He wanted to basically create two new armies to invade through Poland, to invade Germany through Poland. And he did that by taking two good corps away from First Army. So Rennenkampf lost two of his better corps. He lost the Guards Corps, for example, one of his really good corps. And he only got 20th Corps, which are reservists, in return. And in fact, Second Army also lost, and lost a corps as well. So they were weakened by this idea of creating an 8th and 9th Army, which didn't exist at the time, and never actually did come into existence because of events. But they were already weakened by command as well. So that's basically looking at that point of view from the Russian army. Now, let's have a look at a couple of maps. This one is, you'll not see it very clearly because I've taken the whole of the Eastern Front and the Southern Eastern Front, if you want to call, whatever you want to call Serbia. I know there's a certain Nick Lloyd who will say that this is all part of the Eastern Front. I'm not going to get into an argument whether it is or not, but I've done the map like this so that you can see that you've actually got down here at the bottom, you can see my pointer wiring, the front to Serbia. A lot of people geographically, I know I for a long time didn't connect the two together. I didn't put Serbia and the Eastern Front in the same sort of geographical area, but they are not that far apart. They're about 400 miles apart. This is the Serbian front. What it led to in terms of the Austro-Hungarians, without getting into too much detail, is that this second army here could have been down there or could have been up here. It was this idea that if they needed it in Serbia, they'd use it there. If they needed it on the Eastern Front, it would be up there. That's what's going on there. This is what's the big interesting thing. This is Poland. It was Russian. If you're looking at that from any sort of like a wargaming point of view, and you're going to invade, the blues are going to invade the reds. Let's ignore the countries. The blues are going to... Where would you push? Where would you push? Berlin is here, just on the map. It's less than 200 miles from the border, on this border here. That is less than 200 miles. It's about 200 miles. Why weren't the Russians actually getting ready to mobilize around here and just attack into Germany? It's the greatest fear of the Germans. And it's really because they are in a salient. What's the greatest danger of a salient? If you attack around here, if the other forces cut you off in these directions, you've got that idea that all your forces are then trapped. So the Russians were very, very loath to push any of their troops into the Warsaw type of area. In fact, there was a Warsaw garrison which was actually pulled out to create part of the armies that are further back. But that is an important idea, an important thought, and an important element to the Battle of Tannenberg. What we're really bothered about, because all of these down here is Austro-Hungary. This is Galicia. This is where the Austro-Hungarians are fighting. This is where the Russians and Austro-Hungarians will have their first contact, and that itself is an incredibly important and very interesting campaign as well. Somebody ought to cover it at some point, but it doesn't go into this particular battle now. What we're interested in is this area up here, East Prussia. This is Germany. This is the Eastern Prussia part of Germany. If any of you remember maps from the beginning of the Second World War, this is that bit of Germany that's cut off. There's Danzig, and this was the bit that is still Germany at the beginning of the Second World War, but in fact then Poland takes up a lot of this area. So it becomes complicated for the Germans. They split into two. 8th Army, you'll see, is up here. But let's magnify that a little bit by bringing a map that's only that upper part. This is basically how they mobilized. You'll see that the Russians also had a plan A and a plan, I can't remember, it's plan G or whatever. Plan G, that's right. A plan A and a plan G for 4th Army. The 4th Army could either be up in the north or it was going to be in the south here. The idea being that 4th, 1st and 2nd Army will all attack the Germans. Eventually, the 4th Army came down into this part here. It came down here. It was felt too dangerous to have the weaker, to have a too strong a northern part and a weak area here. Mainly because of the worry about the Austro-Hungarians driving into this area here. But 8th Army here, that's what we're worrying about. You'll see, I can't remember if it's very big, but hopefully you'll see that is Tannenberg. We'll talk about the name later on. But Tannenberg is there. A much larger place called Allenstein is slightly further north than Tannenberg. This will be the fighting area. This will be where Tannenberg is decided. And you'll see that it's part of the way in to here. Now, the other geographical thing to look when I'm talking about the fighting in a moment is this is the river Vistula coming up to Danzig and going that way. When I'm talking about retiring to the Vistula, that's how far back. And in fact, that is giving up the whole of East Prussia. So if anybody talks about retiring to the Vistula in defense, then they're giving up the whole of East Prussia. It will be a little bit like the French say we're going to retire to the Seine, giving up a big chunk of France voluntarily. I don't mean they're pushed back, they haven't even voluntarily. So that's just from a geographical point of view. This is the area we'll be looking at, and so that you know the Vistula will go off the map. It's going to be, you'll mostly see this area here, but that's how far back that means, because that will mean something later on. Okay. Another map, and that's basically the first moves. Mobilization. The 8th Army were basically almost fully mobilized because they were the only army in the east. Mobilization made sure that they were fully equipped in terms of men, reservists, and so on and so forth very quickly. The German mobilization is always quick anyway, and it was even quicker in those areas because of its vulnerable position in where it was. The Russians mobilized more slowly. They always do. It's more difficult. They're an enormous country, enormous area to bring men into. But they did mobilize more quickly than the Germans expected. And the initial moves, and we're talking now the sort of August, the second week of August, is that First Army is commanded to basically invade East Prussia. So you'll see that the moves of First Army, the blue arrows, are heading towards East Prussia. Second Army's down here. It has orders to basically move in a north. You'll see that it's moving in a westerly direction here, but their idea is to move westerly and then northwesterly to head in that direction. That's their goal. The problem for these two armies is this area here. I'll actually see if I can use it. I'll go really put this area. Whoa, quite pleased with myself there. They're the Masurian Lakes. Very, very difficult militarily to do anything in or around or through. It almost cuts First and Second Army apart. Very, very difficult to make sure that the two armies do not split and leave an enormous gap between them. What that means is that this area here is very important for Second Army in terms of ensuring that there is communication. And this area here is very important for First Army to make sure they communicate. And communication also, of course, means that they need to be talking to each other. Oops, sorry, let's make sure I don't write over everything now. Right. So these are the initial moves. Now, what we're going to be interested to start off with is First Army. Yes, I know that when we talk about Tannenberg, we're actually talking about Second Army and the destruction of Second Army. That's what's going to happen eventually. But what's going to happen first is that the first contact is in the north. And it is important to cover that area up here, because if we don't get the idea of what's going to happen next and why what happens next and what the reasons for that. And for that particular need, we're going to look at two other people, because these are going to come up. These German commanders are going to come up again and again, both in the early battles and then more importantly as two key figures in the actual Battle of Tannenberg. And they are the two corps commanders von Francois, who's commanding First Corps, and Mackensen, who's commanding 17th Corps. Now, Francois, I think it's a very strange name. He's actually born in Luxembourg as a Huguenot, which is why the name is not particularly German. So they obviously call him Hermann just to make sure that everybody realized he was German. And Prussian, because he was a Prussian general. His father was a Prussian general in the Austro-Prussian War. He's commanding First Corps, and Mackensen in 17th Corps. They are both in this northern part of the 8th Army Command. And they have particular roles and particular actions which are interesting from the follow-up later on in the battle, in the whole campaign. And those two actions are these. This is before any Tannenberg. Plitwitz is still in command, and he tells, just look at the left-hand side to start off with, he tells Francois to fall back on Gumbinin, which is here. There's a particular river around here that he wants both Mackensen and Francois to be in this area here. But Francois thinks differently. He thinks that's giving up. He wants to tackle the Russians on the frontier, because this is a frontier here. These are the Russians just crossing into the frontier. So these are the Russians coming in, and Francois decides to fight. And he really does fight very well. We're not going into great details about it, but he fights in a certain way. It's very open warfare going on here, and he's very clever in moving his divisions and the various regiments he's got in a way that traps the Russians, hits the Russians in the flank. He really does defeat them on their way there. So already the Russians are having a little bit of a difficulty, and Rennenkampf is already seeing this sort of difficulty of moving forward. That's important for later on, that Russian First Army is actually finding it difficult to move forward. He's already disobeyed orders, though. He disobeyed Pritvitz to do that. That comes in to play a little bit later on. So he's seen as a bit of a rogue already. He then gives in and moves back to Gumbinnen, having been a success there. Isn't relieved or anything like that because he was successful. And then they're both, he and Mackensen, are instructed to counterattack, to attack the Russians. So they do at Gumbinnen. So we're now the 20th of August. So what is the Battle of Gumbinnen? Is basically First Corps in the north and Mackensen's 17th Corps in the south. Now, Mackensen eventually becomes a German hero. He is very much the architect of the great successes of the push in 1915, and he goes on to become a field marshal, and etc., etc. But he didn't know about fighting at this point. Both his divisions attack, and you can see the arrows sort of going at the Russians and then hurtling backwards again. They are repulsed with heavy, heavy casualties because they attack without sufficient artillery. Weirdly, this is 2 days before the French are maybe doing their attacks without sufficient artillery, the things that Steve talked about on the Battle of the Frontiers. The German army are doing exactly the same as the French army did, attacked without good preparation. So, eat that one, Mr. Zuber. In the north, even worse happens here, in fact, because it's the two divisions of First Corps, First and Second Division, in fact, behave very differently. First Division tries to attack in the south and is very badly repulsed, but Second Division is actually manoeuvred round to the north. You can see the arrows going round at the top here, around there, gets into the flank of the Russians and basically saves First Division because it's fought to a draw, basically. In terms of casualties, in terms of the condition of everybody, when they both corps are instructed and ordered to retire, as they are, and we'll get into that in a second, they are able to do so without being followed up by Russian First Army. The Russian First Army have had a bloody nose, and they are not going to be following up very quickly, and that is important. So these two battles, although they are not significant, certainly not strategically significant, they are significant in the fact that Rennenkampf, as commander of Russian First Army, has had a bloody nose. He's met serious resistance, he's had quite serious losses, and he's very concerned about moving forward very quickly against what he thinks are superior forces, or he likes to think are superior forces. So, that's got that far. So it's 20th of August. Now, as they retire, these battles are not seen by Pritvitz as particularly successful. He feels he's really, really under pressure. He also knows, if you remember, Second Army are first further to the south. He knows that they are starting to advance into what is Poland, towards Warsaw. He knows his southern flank is in danger. He panics for a little while. For a few hours on one particular day, actually on the 20th of August, he panics a little bit and he starts talking to people about retiring all the way back to the Vistula. Oh, we'll have to retire to the Vistula and make our stand there. Because his instructions are to delay the Russians, to stop the Russians from basically, but that will give up all of East Prussia. That gets back to Moltke. Now, what happens during the day is that various people, Hoffman, for example, who as a character will come up later on, he's his deputy chief of staff, persuade him that that's not necessary. Persuade him that they're strong enough to still be fighting. All they need to do is rearrange where their forces are. And they persuade him that that's possible. And he changes his mind. He's not going to retire. And so Hoffman organizes a change in the positions of the German Eighth Army. Pritvitz thinks, yeah, that's going to be fine. But unfortunately, Moltke has heard about the possible retirement, and that's too much for him, so he's going to get rid of him. And very badly done, because he's not told what's going to happen, but already the Kaiser has been told that he's got to change things, he's got to find a new commander for Eighth Army, and he comes up with a retired general called Hindenburg. Very popular, and a safe pair of hands. We're going to send Hindenburg to Eighth Army. So Hindenburg is basically dragged out of his retirement, not in his pajamas, but not far away, because he arrives at the railway station to get the train. He says, "I've not got much with me." He's not dressed properly, whatever that means, but he eventually is shoved on a train and to head off to the east. He is basically met on the train, or met actually at the station as he's getting on the train, by someone who has made his name for himself at Liège, and that is Ludendorff. Because Ludendorff has now been given the role of Chief of Staff of 8th Army to work with Hindenburg. So the, as I call them, the dynamic duo are first introduced on a railway carriage on the way to the east to take over 8th Army. So Prittwitz is out, he's gone. But what's important here from a post-war claim point of view is that first, the German 8th Army is already rearranging its position. And we'll see that on a map in a little while. Before Hindenburg and Ludendorff even get there, the positions of the positions of the German 8th Army are already how they're going to be for the Battle of Tannenberg. It is not the arrival of Hindenburg and Ludendorff that changes that. They just take advantage of what's there and what they see. Hoffmann has a lot of credit given to him, should have a lot of credit given to him for actually the arrangement and what happens. And it's a lot to do with movement. And movement is something that word, I've just brought this photograph in just to make sure you sort of realize what's going on when you're talking about battles in the East. There are not really trenches as such. Not that we know them on the Western Front. Not that we get to know them on the Western Front. But they dig trenches. They dig in every now and then, as any soldiers will do. But they look like this. Movement is the issue all the time. The two great issues of all the battles in the East, almost all through the war, are movement and communication. Because the fighting is almost of an old-fashioned style with modern weapons. You beat your opponent by taking them in the flank, by outflanking them, as you used to do in Napoleonic times, when the best way to win a battle in Napoleonic times was to somehow break down a line so that you then took the rest of the line in flank. Impossible on the Western Front eventually, the Eastern Front always possible. And that's what was happening here. You saw when Francois, by moving his 2nd Division to the north and outflanking the Russians, he actually saved a difficult situation. Whereas Mackensen actually attacked head-on and failed miserably. And they learned quite quickly about that. Now, that idea of taking in flank, it's not just a matter of battalions taking another battalion. It's divisions being moved to take another division in flank. Even a corps being moved to take another corps in flank. In other words, 2 or 3 divisions taking another 2 divisions in flank. This is a war of maneuver. It's not a war of attrition or war where you are getting the artillery to be the battering ram to get you through trenches. It's been won by movement. But that movement has to be coordinated. And coordination of movement requires communication. And communication of the Russian army was absolutely appalling. They had radio, but the radio didn't work half the time. Their codes were broken by the Germans anyway, because the Germans could read it if it was coded. But sometimes they didn't even have the same code book. So, for example, when 2nd Army, we're going to come to now, when 2nd Army are trying to communicate with 1st Army, they're using different codes. So they don't even know what each other are talking about. Even when they do hear each other, they don't understand. And so communication is almost nil. And that's what's going to be starting to be really the key as we go on into what happens next. Now, these two characters, they come into this situation. That's Hindenburg on the left, and that's Ludendorff on the right. Hindenburg actually spends a lot of the time in the East having his portrait. I chose one of the images of Hindenburg as a portrait of him because I think there are around 20 portraits of Hindenburg, all painted while he's in the East. Reading a biography of Hindenburg, all he seemed to do was sit for a portrait most of the time. The main work is going on with Ludendorff. But these actually made a very key partnership. A lot of people tend to think of Hindenburg as just the figurehead, and Ludendorff is the brains. He actually thinks it all up. But we're going to see how important it is later on in the Battle of Tannenberg that these two people are together at this point. But they are what I call the dynamic duo. They go on to become basically German dictators by the end of the war. They are a dual dictatorship by the end of 17 and into 1918. They're starting together here in their campaign. Their memoirs, when they eventually write them, write Tannenberg very differently to how it actually happened. It's all their doing. They did everything in it. There are all sorts of things in their memoirs as well from Tannenberg, which I'll talk about when I'm summing up at the end. But these two are that's what I mean by the dynamic duo. Okay, so the first moves are starting to go in now. This is the retreat of the northern element of 8th. And this is now the start of the pressure that Second Army is going to make. And you'll notice that there is only one corps down here, 30th Corps. German 30th Corps is the only corps down here, with the whole army heading towards it. So from a wargaming point of view, you would think, oh, this is fantastic. I've got all of these divisions all attacking through here, all of these corps. I've got from 1st Corps all the way through here to 6th Corps, all attacking through here. I've only got one corps to attack. So it's something like around 12 divisions attacking 3. And another division being rushed down to try, the 3rd reserve division rushed down to try and give some support. They start to make progress, but they're not making rapid progress. But the move that Hoffmann sees, and it says Hindenburg's already here then, but in fact, the move that is going to happen has already been planned. And if you notice right up here, you'll see Francois's 1st Corps. And you'll see 17th Corps. These are right all the way up in the north. These 2 corps are going to move. And Hoffmann, this is before Hindenburg and Ludendorff arrive, Hoffmann orders 1st Corps to come from the left flank all the way down to the right flank. It's going to come, it's going to come up. I keep hitting the key, sorry. It's going to come all the way down here by rail. That internal rail system that the Germans have to be able to actually move a whole corps, 2 divisions plus supporting troops and all the rest of it, all the way, all these hundreds of miles, all the way behind the lines to pop up in a different place. What are they doing? They're making a risk, because if you weaken your forces here, what happens if First Army continues to attack? That's the risk that Hoffmann was saying, because he recognised that the biggest risk are these people coming up through here. And that we could actually hold, we've already held First Army, Russia's First Army, with wider forces, and we can continue to do that. So that happens. So we now have this situation. Now we're talking about around the sort of 22nd, 23rd of August now. 1st Corps, you'll see, is now all the way down here. Ignore that there. That's not, I don't know why the map people put this one up here. And ignore all these little red bits here. They were German units that were there when the Russians were first driving into East Prussia. They've all gone. There are no German units right behind the lines here. I don't know why the map people thought they were still there. But what's most important about the map here is to see that what's left up here after the moves that Hoffmann starts and Ludendorff and Hindenburg then continue. Nothing. There is a cavalry division. One cavalry division facing First Army. That's all Rennenkampf has in front of him. The slowness of Rennenkampf even allows Ludendorff to bring Mackenson's 17th Corps down from here, where it was going to be the major defensive against First Army. He brings it down to the left of this force going here now. And you'll notice that they're actually able to say we're going to attack here in the north with 2 corps, and having brought 1st Corps down here, we're going to attack with 2 corps down here. So you're already getting this idea that if the Russians aren't wary of what's happening, anything that's going into this area here it may find itself easy to move forward, but there are forces moving behind it in both directions. And that's basically what happens from around the 26th of August. On the 26th of August, Francois is ordered to attack. He's ordered to attack as in a sort of south to southeast to an easterly to southeasterly direction. He doesn't attack on the 26th, even though he's ordered to, because his troops have not all arrived yet. Remember, they've been trained down all the way from up in Königsberg area, or west of east of Königsberg. He is waiting for them to arrive. So he actually makes his major attack on the 27th of August. So he's going to attack then. He attacks. He's attacking down here. I'll take the southern part first. He's attacking the 1st and I think it's 23rd Corps of the Russians. And he succeeds in breaking through in this direction. In fact, he's breaking through in that way. And Ludendorff then orders him to turn east. Ludendorff's getting a little bit worried about the spread and the difficulty with that. And that's the first of the times when Francois ignores Ludendorff. He ignores the order and he carries on southeastwards. And by doing so, he actually gets into the flank of First Corps and he starts to attack them from the south. So in other words, the Russians are suddenly finding they've got Germans behind them, attacking them from the south. It basically makes the Russians begin to just fall apart. So the 27th and 28th of August, in the southern part, is this period where these Russian corps here are starting to wonder what's happening and what's going to happen. In the north, it's harder going. Mackensen comes down and 17th Corps makes some progress down into this direction against the Russians, but he's finding it a little bit more hard going than Francois is in the south. However, what is happening is that Samsonov, the commander of the Russian Second Army, has lost control of what's happening. He doesn't know what's happening. He, first of all, doesn't know where Rennenkampf is. He's imagining that Rennenkampf is always doing what these blue arrows are doing. Oh, he's heading in this direction. He's going to be coming into this area here very soon. So I don't have to worry too much about any forces that are attacking me down here. He also thinks the German main force is around Allenstein here. So he starts pushing people into that area here because it seems to be possible. He regards that as the area where the Germans do not have any forces, and therefore he can start to attack Allenstein and into the central part of East Prussia, thinking that from the east, Rennenkampf is going to be coming in this direction. He's got absolutely no communication with lots of his corps, and certainly zero communication with Rennenkampf. I want to imagine, if you are wargaming this, and if you wargame Tannenberg, by the way, with the full knowledge of what everything is on the map, the Germans have got no chance. But if you, unless you put really big constraints on the Russians, because the Russians just walk over the Germans. But what you've got to imagine here is you've got a wargame where you have two maps, and they're in different rooms, and you've got two Russian commanders, and they're in different rooms, and they have no idea what's happening in the other room. And that's what's happening here. So Rennenkampf has no idea what's happening with Samsonov and vice versa. And the Germans, however, are able to move from room to room, so they know exactly what's going on. They're reading the Russian wireless signals. They know exactly where the Russians are. However, Ludendorff is having absolute kittens about this time because he is hearing reports of Second Corps, Russian Second Corps, starting to get into this area here. Now, he's thinking they are actually making progress. Now, they're actually advancing about 3 miles a day. Now, I don't know about you or me, but I can walk about 3 miles in an hour. So that's the level that they're advancing at. And they're something like around 40 miles away. So you can imagine how many days at that pace it's going to be before they're anywhere in the vicinity. They're not moving. They're not forced marching. They're not doing anything. They are basically, Rennenkampf regards his units as tired, exhausted. And there's another element that I'm going to come into in a second, in terms of both armies. So you've got a situation then, you've got about the 27th, 28th of August, it's getting desperate now for the Russians, but they don't know it. So it might seem, if you're looking at it now with a map, you think, oh, what do they do? What they should be doing is pulling these people back, First Corps, 15th Corps, pulling these back to the east to create a line, get some connection with the First Army, send one of the corps in that direction, do something to make to connect the two armies together again. But they don't, because they don't know what's happening. Samsonov has got absolutely no idea what's happening. So by the time you get to the 28th, 29th, you have this situation. You do have Second Corps coming in, being held off by a division at the moment. You have all of these corps here who are freely going through East Prussia, but they're miles away. They've gone towards Königsberg, which is a fortress area. It's a fortress it's pointless for the Russians. They should be, all of these should have been down here, and they're not. They're way up there out of the way. But what's happening down here is that the trap has been sprung. First Corps, Francois has come across to this. This is a particular area of railway here, and he's taken that area and it cuts the communications and all the supply communications, etc., of Second Army. And so the various corps that are in here all are falling. They've been heading towards Allenstein or Osterode here, and they suddenly find themselves Germans behind them, and Germans. And they, at some point on the 30th, the men of First Corps, so Francois' men, meet Mackinson's men coming from the east, and so there's basically they're encircled. It's not all of Second Army. This is Sixth Corps of Second Army. Now that looks as if it's saying, "Well, Sixth Corps just run away." In fact, Sixth Corps attack in this direction, and it's quite a nervy time for that, because there's not many. They attack this. Can't quite see it here, but Ortelsburg, which is here, they attack that town, which is only held by very few German forces, but they managed to hold them off. The Russians are so demoralized by this time that they can't even, a whole corps can't even take a village from what are a smattering of a regiment of various units. But help comes from Mackinson, and the Russians eventually are then pulled back into Russia, because this is Russia now. This is the Polish part of Russia. They pull back, so they're saved in a sense. The rest are still lingering here. First Corps, which was the left flank, are also out of that, and they do get through and try to attack in this direction as well, but also that fails. And all the orders then come for them to retire. The orders don't go to Samsonov, however, because on the 27th of August, he has basically gone off into the area of the battle area, away from HQ, to see whether he can take control of what's happening, sees what's happening, because he tries to retreat eastwards and comes across German units and so on, and he just wanders off into a wood and shoots himself. And so Second Army, in essence, ceases to exist. Its leader ceases to exist. In the meantime, Rennenkampf has got nowhere. And that final sort of victory has led to a catastrophe, in a sense, for the Russian army. But it was a near-run thing. And when I was talking about the dynamic duo, Ludendorff may be the brains behind lots of the movement. Francois sometimes disobeyed him, and to the good, but there was never any, and you will come to repercussions of that in a moment. But basically, the duo worked together, because when things were getting tight around the 28th, 29th, because of Rennenkampf coming in from the north, Ludendorff wanted to call the whole thing off. He wanted to pull the troops back. And Hindenburg took him into another room, must have had a go at him, and said, "Pull yourself together, mate." Because when they came out again, it was, "No, we'll carry on as we're doing it." So in other words, Ludendorff was having kittens and would have stopped the attack. And it was Hindenburg that actually pushed him into continuing it. We are succeeding. We will win. So the strength of Hindenburg from that point of view, with the brilliance of Ludendorff tactically, was where this duo then start to make their name. It never really probably looked like this, but I imagine it just captured the sort of mood that the Russians were in when they realized where they were, that things were going wrong. It's the reaction of any troops when they suddenly find that it's not the enemy in front of them, it's the enemy all around them. Where do I go? Where do I run? It's a very dramatic, artistic impression, obviously, done by the Germans. I don't know whether you can see at the bottom, but it's a German description. But it gives that chaos. And I like it really because it's actually, in a sense, a summation of the chaos of the Russian army, First and Second Army at this point. They really are running around like headless chickens, not really knowing what they're doing. And they accepted even post-war times, at this point in 1914, they had no idea how to wage war. Or parts of them didn't anyway. Certainly First and Second Army didn't. The armies in Galicia would argue otherwise, because they seem to know exactly how to fight wars. result was really that. Endless columns of Russian prisoners. The estimates are something around, the German figures for them were 92,000. Argued by the Russians to be much less, but it's probably a reasonable figure. And it's accepted by most authors now, if you're not Russian. Large amounts of material, got lots more prisoners, obviously, but guns and so on by the thousand, because obviously a whole army and all its logistics is gone into there. And it's the logistics that cost them as well. Because just summing up some of the reasons why all this is happening, I've talked about the absolute void of command and them not knowing anything about what was going on. You got the communication part of it, but the logistics in the Russian army at this stage was rubbish. And basically Second Army had not been fed for about a couple of days. So you start getting troops in a problem like we're getting surrounded, or we're getting people on our flank, we don't know what we're doing, and they're hungry and they're exhausted and they're not getting fed, they're not getting any water. They'll just, and it's August, it's hot, so they're not getting water, they're not getting food. They're demoralized. They're just going to give up. So the surrendering, you can totally and utterly understand, because the logistics, the Russians just ignored logistics and paid heavily for it. So casualties overall, the Germans, different estimates. The Russians would put it nearer to 30,000. Most Germans and also quite a few of the authors these days will put it nearer to 14 or 15,000. The Russians, that varies massively. The 92,000 prisoners, which I've said, is disputed by Russian historians, but they even dispute the Battle of the original Battle of Tannenberg. So you could take them with a pinch of salt. But it does seem to be a reasonably accurate one, and various people like Prit Buttar accept it. Other casualties will vary between about the 30 to 50,000. So you can say that the actual figure is probably somewhere of total casualties, somewhere between 90 and 160,000, but likely to be around 130, 140,000, which is most of an army, minus a corps that got away. So fairly disastrous. The name, Tannenberg. It was going to be the Battle of Allenstein, because that's the sort of central town in the middle. Hoffman was the one who suggested Tannenberg. Why Tannenberg? I can't remember the dates or whatever, but the 14th century battle between the Teutonic Knights and the Lithuanian Polish army, which resulted in total and utter defeat for the Teutonics, was grasped upon as that this is our revenge. And so that the idea was that this would go down in mythology as the revenge of the Germans against those horrible Russian, Lithuanian, whatevers, the Polish people of the East. And so the Tannenberg name was then accepted as the battle. And my voice has just about lasted out. So I'll have a bit of a drink redoing that one. But finally, yes, it's a German, I'd say yes, it's a German victory. But what level of victory? The Germans would like to and have written it up, and they certainly wrote it up in 14 all the way through the war as the greatest victory. And it was probably correct. It was the greatest victory of the Great War in terms of casualties because of the way the war was from then on. No other victory had that level of destroying a whole army. Casualties might have been higher in some respects, in some areas, but not in that length of time. These are prisoners of war and casualties within 3 or 4 days. But was it a tactical victory? Yes. Was it a strategic victory? No, because Moltke had already sent 2 corps to the east before Tannenberg. He had already panicked and reduced the Western force that was driving towards Paris by 2 corps. It moved on the 25th of August. Too late to make any effect on the east, but he'd panicked. He'd heard all sorts of reports from the east, and he panicked and sent 2 corps that way. What those 2 corps might have been at the Marne, who knows? So in some respects, yes, a victory, but strategic, I would say not, because the Russians are not beaten by that type of victory. They're not beaten strategically. I read one report which actually was saying that the Russian army never recovered. Of course it recovered. It caused great difficulty for the German army in 16, the Brusilov offensive. and internal revolution was the only thing that really meant that the Germans could claim eventually a strategic victory in the East. It didn't win them anything particularly, other than it made sure the Russians were not going to actually be able to destroy the Austro-Hungarians before the Germans could get more troops across there. So maybe that level of victory was that, but that's something to argue. It's not one I would say I will fall one way or the other on that. I'd just say it's certainly not a total strategic victory. If you want some more reading, top left, the McNally one is one of they're very short little books, about 100 pages. Nice little background to what's going on right there. We've got some reasonable maps in it. Sweetman's a lot. It's not really that great. I'm not happy with Sweetman's story, really. He's not a military historian as such, and I don't think it's very confusing. The one on the right, that is the show went on. Hardly any maps. You can't do Tannenberg without maps. As you see, it's complicated because it's a war of movement, and therefore you need to see what the movement is. And it's not just on Tannenberg, but Prittbutter's first volume of his Eastern Front ones does have a very nice chunk of the pre-battles and Tannenberg in there for you to get your head round. And if you are one of these people who love to follow divisions around on a map, he does talk about the different corps in different divisions going in different directions. And if you want to get to that sort of nitty-gritty, he does do that. And so you can get that out of it. But also looks at it critically as well. And I know there's some critics of Prittbutter, but I think they're quite well written. Or they are well written. Not quite well written. They are well written. And easy to read, easy to take in. I think my voice is just about held. So I will take a big slurp now while Henry sorts out questions.
That was fantastic, Jim. Thank you very much. I don't know. Question, feel free to raise a hand. We did have a couple that just popped in during the talk itself. I think the first one from Louise, I think, has been fairly well answered, which was, where is Tannenberg today and is it still called that? But we had a couple of answers from Yoka and Jan confirming that it's in Poland and is now called something which I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce in Polish.
No, I wouldn't try to. No, never.
But Louise, another question. Go ahead.
Yeah, it was just something in the back of my mind. I don't know where I got this from, so it could be completely wrong. But I thought Russia and Germany, they ran on different gauge railways. Is that correct? Did that cause supply problems?
Yes. It would have done for First Army.
Okay.
The camp had said that he could drive into East Prussia, and of course I could supply my army by rail, without remembering that actually at the railhead at the Russian-German border, the Russian trains would either have to find German trains to put them on, or change the gauge. They do run on different gauge, yeah. Okay. So that would have been a massive problem. One of the things I don't think I mentioned it. One of the problems they had in the Polish area, the big bulge, is that they were so frightened of the Germans driving through that area into Russia that they deliberately left the rails and road links there very poor. So Second Army also had massive logistics problems because they were driving through an area they had behind them. Their logistics were coming from over bad roads, hardly any railway, of their own fault, their own doing. Instead of, thinking we need to be able to defend this area or attack from it, we need to be able to move supplies in quickly. They were so frightened of the Germans taking it over and moving through, they didn't improve it. So that area was a bit of not a wasteland, but logistically very difficult to move up. But I don't think the Russians would have got themselves together anyway. Yeah, and they're ahead of logistically anyway, really. That was always going to be a problem. Yeah. And of course, that's what I said about wargaming. If you wargame it, logistics is always a bit rough in wargaming, and the Russians would just steamroller over the German forces.
Okay. And it also would depend on how much you have in the way of cavalry, because horses are always supply heavy, if you like. And one thing I didn't mention, which
there's too many to mention in a way, is that there is a quite large Russian cavalry corps in the north, very far north of. If you think about where First Army is, it's got a big corps of cavalry in the north, which basically does nothing. When in fact it could have done quite a lot driving into on the sort of right flank of people like the Eighth Army First Corps. Francois, for example, could have found a whole corps of cavalry hurtling down his left flank. And remember, I'm talking about flanks being so important. And he would have been in all sorts of trouble. But the problem with that, I think it's the Third Cavalry Corps, and I can't remember his name because I can't remember Russian names. But the commander of that corps suffered so badly from piles that he couldn't ride, and so he basically didn't do anything all the time. He was basically crying in his tent in pain a lot of the time. It didn't do anything. So a whole corps of cavalry, which could have been, and there's so much could have beens in the Russian army at this stage, that the sort of the alternate history guys that I don't like particularly could have a field day in terms of what the Russians could have done, but they didn't. And they didn't because of very many factors of their own doing, from a command, control, communication, all the modern idea of the command, control, communication ideas. They had none of those. They had, all three were bad. And therefore, that's why it happened the way it did. But the Germans suffered from that a little bit as well. I mean, German communication at this point, we tend to think of radio. You can just phone somebody up, radio somebody, communicate with somebody. Even the Germans had difficulty at times communicating, which Francois used at times because he would say, "I didn't receive that," when he really did. But actually, I think at one point, Mackinson, when he's driving southwards, he doesn't quite know what's happening with First Reserve Corps on his right, and he's trying to find out. And there's like no communication between the two corps commanders. It's Belov, I think it is Belov, who's the commander of that corps, and they're not talking to each other, and they're next to each other in a really important drive south. So communications are still a problem for even the Germans, but they get away with it in a way because the corps commanders themselves are a little bit more able than the Russian corps commanders.
All right.
To think for themselves, as Francois does.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks for the question, Louise. Steve, go ahead.
East Prussia, I know very little about it, particularly at that time. What sort of loss would have been to the Germans, for example? Was it primarily an agricultural area? Was a lot of industry there that would have lost? Or
losing Königsberg, which is basically the capital of East Prussia, would have been a disaster. Probably 80% of it is the homeland of Prussia. When you think of Germany, when you go back to Frederick the Great and all the rest, they're coming from there. That's the area they come from. Germany, as we know it now, is the Germany of the Kaiser of 14, with all of the thing right up to the Rhine and all of those areas, North Rhine-Westphalia, Saxony, all of that area there. That was all taken over by the Prussians. So the Prussians eventually became, in a sense, the leading German nation, but this is their homeland. And 70 or 80% of the generals are from Prussia. It's the military hotbed of leadership. And I mean, I think one of the generals, I can't remember which one it is now, one of the corps commanders, the German corps commanders, actually has to shell his hometown at one point, because they've lost his town and they're trying to retake it, and he shells it, even though it's where he used to live. It's a very personal thing. I mean, you and I will know what I'm talking about. It's like England giving up Yorkshire. We're not going to give up Yorkshire ever. It would have been. That's why Plitvice went. The mere hint that he would give up East Prussia, however strategically it might have been sensible, and in fact he was persuaded it wasn't strategically sensible, because then the two Russian armies could have combined, because then you've not got the marshes between you anymore. It's open countryside. The first and second army could have advanced together to the Vistula, and East Prussia would have gone, and that would have been Really, no, the Germans. That's why Moltke just basically said, right, we're going to get rid of Prittwitz. Anybody who thinks about retiring like that, I don't want to know. So he had to go. So yeah, East Prussia is very it's not really valuable from a Germany would have economically been in trouble if they'd lost it. It is, yeah, you're right. It is actually probably about 80% agricultural. Königsberg is a very important port, very important city, but I think morale-wise, not morally, but morale-wise, the German nation would have stood for it because it was Prussia, was the origins of Prussia.
So by the end of August, there was no real part of Germany under occupation as such, wanted to bring the Russians out.
No. Basically, what the Germans have pushed. The first up, there's the Battle of Masurian Lakes that comes afterwards, which is again the same. It's First Army against Eighth Army, and they created Ninth Army. Germans created Ninth Army, but that's basically to combat the fact that the Austro-Hungarians are suffering in the south. And to join the forces up, Ninth Army is created down further down south. And Eighth Army, which actually gets under Francois for a while, he's actually given command of Eighth Army for a while. But before that, he's fighting still as a corps commander in the Battle of the Masurian Lakes, which is I don't think we'll do another talk on that as well. It's not as important as such. It's the Germans' attempt to get rid of First Army. Ludendorff and Hindenburg turned their attention to defeating First Army, but that battle pushes the Russians out of East Prussia because the Masurian Lakes are actually in Russia. The border's near it, but East Prussia's the border runs near the Masurian Lakes. But that battle basically pushes the Russians out of East Prussia. First Army pushes back. They don't destroy First Army. It's not that successful. It's a sort of a draw in a way, the Battle of Masurian Lakes. Hindenburg don't get what they want. But yeah, you're right then. The Germans actually are back on their own soil. And it's not long before the parts of Poland that are Russian become German. I mean, it's not long before the Germans invade Poland as such. See what I mean? Invade what eventually becomes Poland, invades Warsaw and sort of those areas anyway. That area becomes Poland.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks for the question, Steve. Quick question from me, Jim. You mentioned at the start about Nikolaevich being the vacuum essentially at the top as commander-in-chief. Did that change at all through the rest of the war, or did he remain fairly ineffective throughout?
He's probably the most ineffective of the commander-in-chiefs of any of the armies in terms of, was any decision really his? And I think the answer to that is no. I think Yanushka, I can't say his name properly. I'm going to look at it spelt wise. Yanushkevich, I think it's Yanushkevich, as the chief of general staff, was probably the one who made, at this point, is making more of the decisions. He's eventually moved to one side. There's another one called Danilov, who's the quartermaster general, who's also got a finger in, and he's also sort of influential. Stravka as a whole are the decision making, but whether Nikolaevich was actually ever made a decision in the way that even French made a decision. Here you go. But certainly the way that Joffre made a decision over this is where we'll attack or this is where we'll do. He never came in with that sort of decision.
Yeah.
Eventually, he had different people. There were eventually 3 army groups, if you want to call them that, and they tended to run the show with Stavka. When he gets to 16 with the Brusilov offensive, there's no real control there. But even Brusilov does his own thing in the end.
Yeah.
They really don't have that. It's almost as if the fact that they've got so much space means that no one really feels that they're in command enough to say what we're going to do strategically. And I think that's one of the problems for the Russian army through 15 and 16, in that they've got enough firepower of men to really put the Austro-Hungarians and Germans in a lot of trouble. but they don't control it enough because there's no central control. There's no good central control. And then eventually they give up and they sack Nikolaevich and put the Tsar in charge, which is like a disaster, because that makes the Tsar personally responsible for all the things that then happen, which doesn't add to his great, add to the sort of revolutionary, the anti-revolutionary cause.
Mm.
There is a power vacuum in the Russian command almost all the way through. It's a struggle between lords, the equivalent of lords and earls and so on, and back into the Middle Ages. It's like that, without a king who's actually saying this is what we should do.
Yeah.
There's no king commander. There's no that. There's no. The Russians suffer that badly.
Yeah. Interesting. Great. Thank you very much. Well, that seems like a good opportunity to bring tonight's proceedings to a close. So just once again, thank you, Jim, for a superb talk. I think everyone really, really enjoyed it. So